Number 6. Jesse L. Matthew. Virginia Tech student Morgan Dana Harrington accompanied 3 of her friends to a Metallica concert at the John Paul Jones Arena in Charlottesville on October 17th of 2009. During the opening act's performance, 20-year-old Harrington reportedly left to use the restroom but somehow got outside of the arena and was subsequently denied re-entry by security. She contacted her friends and told them not to worry, stating that she'd simply make her way back home. The young woman was last seen alive hitchhiking on a nearby bridge at about 9:30 p.m. According to eyewitness testimony the following day, Harrington's purse containing her ID card and cell phone was found in the RV lot at the University of Virginia's athletic field. Following an extensive police investigation, her skeletal remains were ultimately discovered in January of 2010, roughly 10 miles from the arena in a remote area of the 742-acre Anchorage Farm complex. Although the authorities didn't release the details of Harrington's death, her parents later revealed that it was extremely violent in nature and that several of her bones had been broken. The case remained unsolved until the fall of 2014 when Hannah Graham, a second-year student at the University of Virginia, was abducted and later found dead on an abandoned property in Albemarle County. Investigators were able to use forensic evidence to link the 2 cases to the same perpetrator, Jesse L. Matthew. The latter, who'd faced 2 previous assault accusations in the early 2000s, had attempted to reinvent himself, working periodically as a taxi driver and hospital porter. However, he'd been leading a double life, regularly stalking young women at bars during the nighttime hours. In March of 2016, Matthew pleaded guilty to the abduction and murder of both Graham and Harrington, and he consequently received 4 life sentences, with no possibility of parole. Number 5. William Nando Usma Aosta. In June of 1994, Colombian man William Nando Usma Aosta gunned down his wife during a domestic violence incident before firing at his daughter when she tried to intervene. Shortly thereafter, the man fled the country and, according to the FBI, became the subject of an Interpol Red Notice. Sometime in 1995, Usma Aosta entered the United States illegally and began living in the town of Belmont, Massachusetts, under the alias Carlos Alberto Rendon. While his whereabouts remained unknown to the authorities, Usma Aosta was sentenced to 45 years in prison after being convicted in absentia to charges of aggravated murder, aggravated attempted murder, and illegal possession of a firearm. In June of 2020, the FBI received a tip that the fugitive might have been residing in the greater Boston area, and the agency's Violent Crimes Task Force ultimately tracked him down to his home in Belmont. According to subsequent reports, Usma Aosta had married a United States citizen in 1998 and had begun leading a double life with his American wife and son. He later applied for naturalization to the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, allegedly submitting a fraudulent Colombian birth certificate and fingerprints to cover up his criminal past. In April of 2022, the FBI and Immigrations and Customs Enforcement announced that Usma Aosta had finally been arrested. It was reported that he'd be relinquished to the custody of Colombian authorities, after which he'd begin the prison sentence associated with his wife's murder. Number 4. Paige Bergfeld. On June the 28th of 2007, Colorado woman Paige Bergfeld left her 3 children with their live-in nanny at her Grand Junction residence, indicating that she'd return later that evening. However, having never come back home as she promised, 34-year-old Bergfeld was soon reported missing to the police. A few days later, her vehicle was discovered set ablaze in a Grand Junction parking lot. Bergfeld herself was nowhere to be found, but many of her belongings had reportedly been strewn along the side of Highway 50. As the police continued their effort to track down the missing woman, they uncovered that she'd secretly been leading a double life, running an escort business called Models Inc. While interviewing her acquaintances, investigators learned that the twice-divorced woman was known in online advertisements as Carrie, a high-priced escort. Although her family was unaware of her scandalous double life, it was believed that Bergfeld had started her secret enterprise to help pay off her debts, which included a huge mortgage. In 2012, the woman's skeletal remains were found by hikers in Delta County. Bergfeld's bones reportedly suggested that she'd sustained a badly fractured cheekbone at or near the time of her death. Lester Ralph Jones, who had solicited the victim's escort services the day before she went missing, was identified as a suspect in her disappearance and was later arrested for her murder. Jones's first criminal trial ended in a hung jury. However, following a retrial in 2016, he was convicted of each count levied against him, including first-degree murder and kidnapping. He was consequently sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Number 3. Ernest Shir III. The decomposed bodies of Ernest Shir Jr. and Charlene Abendroth were found at their Castlewood Country Club home in Pleasanton, California, on March 14, 2008. As was subsequently gathered by investigators, the couple had been brutally beaten with a baseball bat before having their throats slashed. A few weeks after the Alameda County Sheriff's Office launched an official investigation into the slayings, a pair of detectives traveled to Las Vegas to speak with Bill Krause, a nightclub musician and friend of the victim's son, Ernest Shir III. Krause would later testify in court that Shir had approached him and inquired about obtaining a firearm a couple of weeks before the murders were committed. Although the two did go to a gun store in Pahrump to shop around, Krause indicated that they didn't ultimately purchase anything. On the day the bodies were discovered, Shir allegedly called Krause to tell him that he had to go to California because of a family emergency. However, Krause claimed that 31-year-old Shir had sounded so well put together, despite having supposedly just learned that his parents had been brutally murdered. It subsequently emerged that Shir had been leading a double life in Las Vegas, one characterized by casual dating and a career as a professional poker player. He'd kept it a secret from his family back in Brea, California, where he was a married father of one. Shir was eventually arrested in early 2009 after Alameda County authorities had collected enough circumstantial evidence to pursue criminal charges against him in connection to his parents' deaths. In March of 2011, the man was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, as well as 3 special circumstances allegations, 2 counts of murder for financial gain, and 1 count of committing multiple murders. Prosecutors contended that Shir had killed his parents in order to gain access to his sizable inheritance, which he'd intended to use to pay off the gambling debts he'd accrued as part of his secret life in Las Vegas. As a consequence for his conviction, Shir was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Number 2. Kathleen West. On the morning of January the 13th of 2018, a resident of Escalera, Alabama, found the lifeless body of her neighbor Kathleen West lying face down across the street from her home. Upon inspecting the scene further, the neighbor discovered that the woman, a wife and mother of one, was only partially clothed and had a bloody wound on her head. A cell phone had been placed on the ground next to her body along with an empty bottle of the plant-based spirit absinthe. Local authorities subsequently launched an official probe into the matter, during which they interviewed dozens of witnesses and submitted several volumes of evidence for testing. As the murder investigation progressed over the course of the next 5 weeks, it publicly emerged that West, whose social media presence suggested that she'd been an average suburban housewife, had actually been leading a double life as an online model. She reportedly operated a subscription-only adult website where she posted extremely suggestive photographs of herself in scantily clad outfits under the alias Kitty Cat West. On the morning of February the 22nd, Escalera police formally charged the victim's husband, William Jeff West, a former U.S. military policeman and campus security guard, with her murder. Police records indicated that while William claimed to have never had a problem with his wife's online alter ego, he'd carried out her killing nevertheless, perhaps as a form of retribution for her titillating exhibitionism. Prosecutors contended that William had fatally struck the victim over the head with a liquor bottle before discarding her body in the street. Following a 4-day trial, he was convicted of manslaughter and consequently sentenced to 16 years in prison. Number 1. Brandon Woodruff. A 19-year-old student at Abilene Christian University in Texas was arrested for the murder of both of his parents at their home in Royce City in October of 2005. The suspect, Brandon Woodruff, had reportedly visited his parents' house on the night of October the 16th. The teen later told investigators that he left after the family had dinner together, but 2 days later his parents, Dennis and Norma Woodruff, were found brutally murdered in their home. Brandon was named as the prime suspect, given that he'd been the last known person to see the victims alive. Royce City Police later detailed how Dennis had been shot once and stabbed 9 times, while Norma had suffered multiple gunshot wounds and had her neck slashed. Although the medical examiner wasn't able to confirm the victim's time of death, investigators concluded that the murder must have been committed between 9 and 11 p.m. on the night of Brandon's visit. Despite vehemently maintaining his innocence, Brandon was ultimately taken into custody on a charge of capital murder. It subsequently emerged that the teen had secretly been leading a double life as a gay man. He reportedly had a steady girlfriend at the time. However, it was determined that he'd been dating other men, regularly danced at gay nightclubs, and had even traveled out of state to appear in adult films. Brandon was ultimately found guilty of his parents' murder and sentenced to spend the remainder of his life behind bars. In May of 2022, Brandon was featured in an episode of ABC's investigative journalism series, 2020. In it, he claimed that he hadn't been given a fair trial and that the jury had only convicted him because he'd been portrayed as a wild gay man, leading a crazed double life. Brandon further indicated that he would never stop fighting to prove his innocence and finally obtain exoneration. Number 10. Anthony Roldan. On May the 21st of 2021, Anthony Roldan murdered 18-year-old Adrian Navarro and 23-year-old Destiny Nunez at a Chicago convenience store. Roldan, who was 17 at the time, had become embroiled in an argument with the couple while waiting in line. He was accompanied by Justice Pierce, aged 20, who participated in the brawl that ensued after Navarro threw a bottle at Roldan's head. The store's surveillance cameras showed the suspect fighting with Navarro before pulling out a firearm and shooting both victims. Although Nunez and her boyfriend managed to run into the parking lot and ask for help, they succumbed to their gunshot wounds later that night. Roldan was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder, while Pierce was accused of aggravated battery for his behavior before the shooting broke out. Number 9. Richard Rojas. On May the 18th of 2017, Richard Rojas drove his car into a crowd in New York City's Times Square, killing 18-year-old tourist Elisa Elsman and injuring over 20 others. 26-year-old Rojas had allegedly ingested illegal substances before the horrific attack, the victims of which he had no prior association with. After the police subdued him, Rojas seemed agitated, screaming that he wanted the officers to shoot him during the subsequent court proceedings. Rojas claimed to have been hearing voices and indicated that the man had a history of driving under the influence and had been dishonorably discharged from the Navy in 2014 due to past arrests. He was ultimately found not guilty to 1 count of second-degree murder and 38 assaults by reason of insanity. A year later, the victims of Rojas's rampage filed multiple lawsuits against him and the city of New York. The man countersued the families, claiming that they were responsible for their injuries, but agreeing that city officials had been recklessly negligent. Number 8. Yanni Baros. On October the 6th of 2022, 32-year-old Yanni Baros fatally stabbed 2 people and wounded another 6 on the Las Vegas Strip. Baros, who'd immigrated to the US illegally, approached a group of women employed by the best showgirls in Las Vegas and requested to take a picture with them while wielding a kitchen knife. He became enraged when the women declined and attacked them, stabbing 30-year-old Maris DiGiovanni and several other passers-by. One of DiGiovanni's co-workers, identified only as Anna, was subsequently attacked while attempting to administer first aid to the initial victim, 47-year-old Brent Allen Hallett, who had no connection to the showgirls or Baros, also died at the scene. The man was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder with a deadly weapon and 6 counts of attempted murder. The case's preliminary hearings were set for January the 12th of 2023. Number 7. The Petros Maniacs. A notorious Ukrainian trio known as the Petros Maniacs murdered 21 people between 2005 and July the 23rd of 2007, the day they were finally taken into police custody. Most of the crimes committed by Viktor Igorovich Sayenko, Igor Vladimirovich Suprunik, and Alexander Alexandrovich Hanza reportedly occurred during a 4-month spree. The 3 men, all born in 1988, each came from wealthy families and attended school together. After graduating, Supruniuk began driving an unlicensed taxi and recruited his friends to take part in a scheme to rob his passengers. It wasn't until July of 2007 that the group's criminal exploits escalated to murder. They randomly selected Yekaterina Ilchenko and Roman Tatarovich as their unfortunate first victims, bludgeoning them to death on the street within an hour of each other. Their murder spree was eventually brought to light after one of their victims managed to escape and another was killed in front of multiple witnesses. Police monitored the maniacs' phones to pinpoint their locations. Officers arrested Supruniuk after he turned one of the devices on while attempting to sell the stolen belongings. During the ensuing trial, grisly recordings of the murders emerged, including one that was leaked online. The disturbing images show the violent death of Sergei Tatsenk, which took place on July the 12th of 2007, while Sayenko and Supruniuk were sentenced to life in prison. Hansa, who was said to have only participated in the robberies and non-lethal attacks, was jailed for 9 years. Number 6. Peter Zizopoulos. EMT Alison Russo-Elling was only months away from retiring from her position at the New York City Fire Department when she was tragically killed on September the 29th of 2022. 61-year-old Russo-Elling was reported as one of the first responders to the aftermath of the World Trade Center attack, was murdered by a documented schizophrenic named Peter Zizopoulos. On the day of the incident, the 34-year-old man was captured by a surveillance camera, sneaking up to Russo-Elling and stabbing her in an entirely unprovoked attack. The footage showed Zizopoulos fleeing the scene after a witness intervened, leaving Russo-Elling with several critical stab wounds, including the lethal puncture to her chest. Although she was immediately rushed to the Mount Sinai Astoria Hospital, doctors were unable to revive her and she passed away shortly thereafter. Zizopoulos later pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. He was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation before returning to court on November the 29th of 2022. Number 5. Amber Campbell and John Arwood. On December the 30th of 2015, Amber Campbell and John Arwood were arrested for misusing the 911 system and trespassing onto the campus of Daytona State College in Florida. The couple had reportedly snuck into a closet in the college's Marine and Environmental Science Center during a long holiday weekend. 2 days later, 25-year-old Campbell and Arwood, aged 31, dialed 911 and claimed to have been locked inside. When officers arrived at the scene, they discovered that the door did not in fact lock and that the closet was filled with human feces and smelled strongly of illicit substances. Both Campbell and Arwood had a long history of criminal activity. The latter had been jailed 5 different times since 2000, while Campbell was arrested after escaping a health facility and attacking a police officer on April the 30th of 2013. The young woman reportedly stole her brother's car along with an accomplice before crashing the vehicle and providing a false identity to the authorities. After being placed in the police cruiser, she complained that she was experiencing shortness of breath and managed to escape through the window. Before being arrested for a second time, Campbell punched a deputy and needed to be shot with a stun gun. Her 2015 trespassing charges violated the parole associated with her previous sentence, which included charges of battery, resisting an officer, and giving a false name upon being arrested. Number 4. Britney Kemker. In January of 2015, Britney Kemker was arrested for threatening her boyfriend of 2 weeks after he attempted to break up with her. The 21-year-old woman, a resident of Daytona Beach, Florida, reportedly attempted to recruit a friend of hers to aid in the vengeful attack on her ex, whose identity wasn't released by the authorities. Fortunately, the police were notified of the situation before the assault took place. Kemker had an extensive criminal history that included several previous arrests dating back to 2011, involving possession of an illicit substance, battery, and DUI. She was booked on charges of making threats to do bodily harm in connection to her latest run-in with law enforcement. As of the latest available updates, it was unclear how the case's legal proceedings ultimately played out. Number 3. Jeremy Pauley. Pennsylvania resident Jeremy Pauly was arrested for attempting to sell human remains over the internet in August of 2022. 40-year-old Pauly, who worked as a body modification artist, had posted several pictures of his personal collection of body parts and contacted an unnamed woman in Arkansas to purchase more. He offered the seller $4,000 for the illegally obtained remains, which had been allegedly stolen from the University of Arkansas. After Pauly's nefarious transaction was reported to the authorities, police raided his house, where they discovered several full skeletons that had been purchased years earlier. Additionally, new parts intended for resale were retrieved, including brains, skin, hearts, lungs, and livers. Number 2. Candice Cell. 37-year-old Candice Cell was arrested on October the 27th of 2016 for making several threatening 911 calls and chasing cars on foot in Montgomery County, Tennessee. Several passers-by contacted the authorities, reporting that a half-naked woman wearing clown makeup was acting erratically and running behind cars on the roadway. By the time police arrived at the scene, the suspect had returned to her house. After interviewing witnesses, deputies managed to determine Cell's location. She answered the door half naked and heavily intoxicated, and after being taken into custody was charged with disorderly conduct and frivolously calling emergency services. Cell initially denied the accusations, but eventually admitted to jumping into traffic, although the reasons for her unstable behavior weren't made clear. She was released after posting a $1,500 bond. Number 1. Carla Jefferson. On August the 8th of 2022, 51-year-old Carla Jefferson was arrested in St. Petersburg, Florida, for calling 911 over 12,000 times and threatening operators. Local authorities indicated that Jefferson's call accounted for 10% of all communications made with emergency services in the precinct. Over the course of the previous 8 months, Jefferson would dial 911 multiple times a day and routinely insult call takers. At the height of her harassment, she reportedly called 512 times within a 24-hour period. Jefferson had already been arrested once before in June of 2022, but following her release, continued her purposeless calls because she loved playing games. Several attempts to stop the woman's unhinged behavior were made before charges were ultimately filed. Officials reportedly sent a mental health team to her home, issued verbal warnings, and also sent her cease and desist letters. In the end, Jefferson was charged with 3 misdemeanors before being released on her own recognizance. Number 7. Owen Rockwell. On August the 24th of 2021, a fiery crash on a roadway near Miami, Florida, resulted in the death of an innocent driver. The victim collided directly into a vehicle that was traveling the wrong way down an express lane. The reckless driver responsible for the crash was 38-year-old Owen Rockwell of Collier County. At roughly 5 a.m. in the morning, witnesses watched as Rockwell made a U-turn near the Miami Gardens exit of I-95 and began driving south on the highway's northbound lanes. As Rockwell approached the Golden Gates interchange, he slammed into the front end of a Subaru SUV while traveling at an extremely high speed. The impact launched the Subaru over the edge of the highway overpass, causing it to plummet nearly 85 feet to the ground below. The vehicle landed on its roof and subsequently burst into flames. A road ranger named Larry Cherry was coincidentally in the area when the accident occurred. He ran to the car, hoping that he might be able to rescue its passengers. He managed to pull 41-year-old Ed Gonzalez from the back seat of the burning car, but he was unable to extricate the driver, who was killed in the blaze. Gonzalez was taken to Aventura Hospital in critical condition. He continued to receive treatment in the months following the brutal accident. A GoFundMe campaign was started by Gonzalez's family to help alleviate the financial burden brought on by their medical bills. Rockwell received treatment for his injuries as well, but he was later arrested at the hospital and charged with vehicular manslaughter. Florida police reportedly discovered an empty beer bottle in his vehicle, and officers also noted the distinct smell of marijuana emanating from inside. Number 6. Tommy Lyon. Tommy Lyon and Emily Colley were on a dream getaway in Phuket, Thailand, in February of 2017 when tragedy struck. The Australian couple was visiting Kata Beach that day and decided to rent a pair of jet skis. After the couple had been driving their jet skis for not even a few minutes, They collided with each other at a high speed. 20-year-old Emily was thrown off and was pulled unconscious from the water by first responders, while 22-year-old Tommy came away relatively unscathed. Lifeguards performed CPR on Collie until paramedics arrived, and she was then loaded into an ambulance. Tommy joined her in the ambulance as he broke down in tears. She was rushed to a nearby hospital but pronounced dead on arrival. The neck and shoulder injuries she had incurred turned out to be too severe. Tommy later explained to police that the bright reflection of the sun on the water had made it impossible for him to spot his girlfriend. Tommy took full responsibility for the accident and was quick to apologize to Emily's family. Her family went on to encourage local authorities to consider the matter an unfortunate accident, but Tommy was charged with reckless driving, causing death nevertheless. Tommy was facing a sentence of up to 10 years but was back in Australia the next month. So it's believed that the authorities gave in to Collie's family's outspoken desire for Tommy not to be punished for the incident. Number 5. Cynthia Covert. 58-year-old Cynthia Covert of Johns Island, South Carolina, was killed by an alligator behind her friend's house on Kiowa Island in May of 2020. Covert had traveled for an at-home nail appointment for one of her clients when the fatal attack occurred. According to the homeowner, the manicurist began acting strangely after she'd finished doing her nails. She noticed an alligator located in the pond behind the house and suddenly became fascinated with it. She started taking photographs of the dangerous predator, inching closer and closer to it until she was waist-deep in pond water. Covert's friend began pleading with her to get out of the water, recounting how she had just seen the alligator grab a deer from the exact spot where she stood. Covert ignored the warnings and continued to move closer to the gator, trying to touch it with her hands. Suddenly, the animal seized Covert's left leg in its jaws, pulling the woman below the surface. Her friend's husband and a neighbor who'd heard the commotion managed to pull Covert out of the water for a brief moment by tossing a rope down to her. The gator clamped on the beautician and pulled her back in. It then began to death roll her violently by twisting and turning its body. Police officers and firefighters eventually arrived at the house, but not in time to save the woman. They waited roughly 10 minutes for her body to resurface, at which point they shot the animal in the head to free Covert from its grasp. She was pronounced dead at the scene. An autopsy determined that the ill-fated woman had drowned. Number 4. Pavet Galabaria. A 60-year-old Indian farmer named Pavet Galabaria retaliated against a snake that had bitten him by killing it with his teeth. In July of 2019, Baria was out in the fields with a group of villagers from the Mahasagar district when the workers spotted a snake emerging from behind a truck that was being used to load maize. The other farmers fled in fear of the dangerous animal, but Baria stood his ground, boldly claiming to have handled snakes before. He picked the serpent up with his bare hands in a reckless attempt to move it away from the work area. The venomous snake lunged at the farmer, biting him in the hands and face. An enraged Baria then plunged his own teeth into the slithering attacker, fatally injuring it. The man was rushed to a hospital in Lunawara, but doctors' attempts to save his life proved futile. The venom from the snake's fangs had already wrought havoc on Baria's body, and he passed away within hours. Number 3. Andrew James Rodriguez. A 58-year-old man traveling on a moped in Las Vegas, Nevada was fatally struck by a drunk driver that was more than 3 times over the legal speed limit. Walter Richard Anderson was riding his 225-pound Tao scooter along Russell Road in southwest Vegas just before midnight on June the 5th of 2021. The driver that struck him was Andrew James Rodriguez, age 33, who'd gotten behind the wheel of a 2017 Lamborghini Huracan while intoxicated. He and a female passenger were making their way to a party across town. The stretch of road where the accident took place had a posted speed limit of 45 miles per hour. Rodriguez pushed his limit to 141 miles per hour in the moments before he collided into the back of Anderson's moped. The initial impact was so powerful that the scooter actually became lodged under the Lamborghini. The sheer blunt force trauma generated by the crash killed Anderson instantly. Police officers who arrived at the scene recounted that Rodriguez's eyes were noticeably bloodshot and noted a pervasive smell of alcohol on him. He was arrested on charges of reckless driving and driving under the influence. Number 2. The New York City subway surfer. A 32-year-old man attempting to ride on the top of a New York City subway train car plummeted to his death on October the 2nd of 2021. In the early morning hours, the thrill-seeker, who was not immediately identified by police, climbed on top of the J train traveling southbound and began subway surfing as it circulated on its daily route. As the subway approached the Williamsburg Bridge, which connects Manhattan and Brooklyn, the rider lost his footing and fell from the top of the car to the northbound tracks below. He was subsequently struck by an oncoming train as he lay injured on the railway. The New York Police Department was notified of the incident via a 911 call, placed at around 4:30 a.m. Officers found the man unconscious and unresponsive on the tracks. Emergency medical personnel pronounced him dead at the scene. The authorities determined there'd been no foul play involved in the unfortunate incident. Number 1. Stephanie Mayorga and Paige Escalera. A couple from Wilmington, North Carolina, mysteriously went missing for 3 weeks after embarking on an excursion to celebrate their engagement. 27-year-old Stephanie Mayorga and Paige Escalera, aged 25, were last spotted by a surveillance camera climbing into the latter's dark gray Dodge Dart at about 9 p.m. on April the 15th of 2020. Later that same night, a 911 call was placed by someone who claimed to have witnessed a vehicle blow through a stop sign at staggering speed and subsequently crash into the woods near an intersection. A team of emergency responders that included police officers, firefighters, and a medical crew were dispatched to the location around midnight. Upon arriving at the intersection, however, the authorities found no signs that a collision had occurred, as the 911 caller had reported. Officers responded to what was deemed a more urgent call after spending fewer than 8 minutes at the scene. The couple's roommate hadn't reported the women missing until April the 19th, as she was under the impression that one needed to wait a period of 72 hours before filing a missing persons report. A nationwide search for Mayorga and Escalera was then set in motion. It wasn't until May the 4th, 20 days after their sudden appearance, that any significant headway was made in the investigation. Officers returned to the same intersection that had been previously visited by first responders on April the 15th. This time, however, investigators used machetes to hack through the thick vegetation that was growing off the side of the road. They went into a marshy area that was the entrance to a marina on the Cape Fear River. They soon discovered the couple's wrecked vehicle nestled deep within the dense woods. The women's decomposing corpses were still inside the car. The police used data collected by the car's computer to establish that Mayorga, who was behind the wheel at the time of the crash, had been traveling at roughly 103 miles per hour in the moments before the deadly accident. Investigators confidently determined that aside from speed, alcohol was a likely contributing factor in the wreck, as several open beer bottles were found inside the vehicle. The Wilmington Police Department came under heavy fire in the incident's aftermath. Members of the public strongly criticized the department's failure to conduct a thorough search of the area surrounding the intersection on the night they'd been first called to the scene. Number 8. Devin Pelum. In June of 2015, 23-year-old Devin Pelum stumbled upon a Comcast worker in his bedroom, which sent him into a violent rage that eventually led to him being arrested and criminally charged. Pelum, who was living with his grandmother in Portland, Oregon, at the time, allegedly smashed computer parts and tossed various other objects around the room. After finding the worker replacing a modem, the young man's grandmother confronted him about his infantile behavior, at which point he slapped the elderly woman and threw her to the ground. Pelum was asked to leave the house, but upon doing so, he began breaking his grandmother's potted plants and shattering her car windows. He then vandalized the vehicle belonging to his great-grandmother, who tried to stop him only to be punched and knocked to the pavement. A neighbor who'd witnessed the tantrum up to that point helped the great-grandmother escape. Pelum subsequently targeted 2 of the neighbors' cars using a brick, glass bottles, and a wood plank to inflict a myriad of scratches, break a side mirror, and smash the windshield. Police eventually arrived at the scene, where they found a shirtless Pelum with a brick in his hand. The young man shifted his ire towards law enforcement, reportedly kicking and spitting while being restrained in the back of a cruiser. He was booked into the Multnomah County Jail on charges of 1st and 2nd degree criminal mischief, harassment, and 4th degree assault. Number 7. Kylie Dipper. In the late evening hours of August the 16th of 2019, the police in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, heard a woman screaming loudly in the area of 143 Rehoboth Avenue. Officers subsequently encountered 22-year-old Kylie Dipper, who was said to have been in hysterics because she'd gotten separated from her boyfriend. Law enforcement helped reunite the young woman with her boyfriend at a nearby hotel. Then a few minutes later, the police were called back to the hotel after Dipper had begun screeching yet again. It was subsequently reported that she simply would not stop screaming and began to disturb several other hotel guests, at which point the officers took her into custody. As Dipper was being led into a patrol car, she allegedly became combative, kicking an officer in the leg and continuing her incessant yelling. After finally being restrained, Dipper reportedly vomited in the police cruiser and urinated on the floor of the holding area at the Rehoboth Beach Police Department. The Pennsylvania resident was booked on charges of resisting arrest with force or violence, offensive touching of a law enforcement officer, disorderly conduct, and creating a physically offensive condition. She was held at the Sussex Correctional Institution on $3,200 secured bail. Number 6. William David Scott Jolly. A video in which a man was captured throwing a violent tantrum at a Canadian McDonald's began circulating online in the summer of 2021. The footage showed the irate customer named as William David Scott Jolly knocking down plastic safety guards, throwing a garbage can at employees, and aggressively destroying the fast food eatery's displays as workers and customers alike pleaded with him to stop. The incident, which reportedly took place at the Ironwood Plaza in Richmond, British Columbia, led to 30-year-old Jolly getting arrested on charges that included mischief over $5,000, assault, and assaulted a peace officer. The latter count stemmed from the fact that upon the arrival of law enforcement at the restaurant, Jolly became violent with the arresting officers before finally being restrained. It subsequently emerged that the entire ordeal had been precipitated by Jolly's order being mistyped as a Happy Meal. Although the staff offered to refund the man's money for the mistake, he became belligerent and hostile, at which point the police were called, which only infuriated him further. Number 5. Passion Shanae Coleman and Laglenda Damona Carr. At about 1:30 p.m. on October the 5th of 2019, law enforcement in Costa Mesa, California were called to Maggiano's Little Italy in the 3300 block of Bristol Street after receiving reports of vandalism. Officers arrived at the restaurant a short time later, whereupon they arrested a pair of women, one of whom was a disgruntled former employee, in a nearby parking lot after they'd allegedly attempted to flee the scene. It was ultimately determined that Passion Shanae Coleman and Laglenda Damona Carr had targeted the former's previous employer in an unhinged outburst in which thousands of dollars worth of damage was reportedly caused with a baseball bat. The women destroyed a television set as well as table settings and plates while shouting and behaving disruptively. After being booked at the Costa Mesa Police Department jail, 27-year-old Coleman was charged with assault with a deadly weapon, criminal threats, felony vandalism, burglary, felony conspiracy to commit crimes, and a misdemeanor warrant for a suspended license. Her bail was set at $500,000. Carr, who was 24 at the time, reportedly faced the same charges but had her bail set at only $25,000. In February of the following year, Coleman reached a plea deal with prosecutors, which led to her spending 180 days in jail for the destructive tantrum. Her accomplice also pleaded guilty and was consequently sentenced to 200 hours of community service, as well as 45 days in jail. Number 4. Andrew O'Keefe. A former Australian television presenter best known for hosting the game shows Deal or No Deal and The Chase Australia was arrested in January of 2022 for an alleged domestic violence incident at his Sydney bachelor pad. Andrew O'Keefe, who was 50 at the time of his latest run-in with law enforcement, was accused of attacking a 38-year-old woman who'd come to his apartment to discuss the possibility of them starting a business together. Subsequent reports detailed how the man had grabbed the victim by the throat and pushed her to the ground before unloading a barrage of strikes upon her. The incident ultimately garnered international attention, but mostly due to the unhinged tantrum O'Keefe threw while being taken into police custody in the aftermath. As was recorded by television news cameras present at the scene, the ex-TV star shouted profanities at law enforcement and kicked the walls of a police van while being led out of his home. O'Keefe repeatedly cried that he was the victim of a crime, while urging the officers to get rid of the journalists. The man was later denied bail while being held on 2 counts of intentionally choking a person without consent, 3 counts of common assault, and assault occasioning actual bodily harm. His arrest marked the second time in a year that it faced domestic assault charges. Back in January of 2021, O'Keefe had been accused of attacking his partner but later had those charges dismissed after it was determined that he'd been in a hypomanic bipolar state when the offending occurred. Number 3. 2017 tube train rant. An unruly passenger on board a London tube train went viral in March of 2017 after video footage of his outburst surfaced on social media. The incident occurred after the unnamed male traveler allegedly barged past a woman who responded to his perceived impertinence by saying, "Excuse me." The seemingly trivial exchange ultimately provoked the man into unleashing a rage-fueled rant at her in front of dozens of shocked witnesses, as was captured in a cell phone video recorded by fellow passenger Nick Craven. The furious man bellowed, "Don't you shout at me, you stupid woman," before asserting that he was the last person she'd want to start on. The other people on board the Hammersmith and City Line train bound for Barking attempted to calm the man down, but he continued his expletive-filled tantrum for roughly 3 minutes. The situation organically diffused itself when the man finally returned to his seat to calm down, reportedly by playing Sudoku. Number 2. Tina Kindred. Florida woman Tina Kindred was tased and arrested by Ocala law enforcement after having thrown a tantrum in the nude at a pair of local restaurants on June the 4th of 2021. The 53-year-old was caught on video smashing glass bottles and breaking other merchandise while unclothed at both a Mojo Grill and Outback in the Marion County city. Employees and other diners at the eateries pleaded with Kindred to stop as she wreaked havoc, destroying seemingly everything she could get her hands on while screaming incoherently. An Ocala police officer was eventually called to the Outback, where he approached the woman and attempted to calm her down. Kindred instead proceeded to launch glass bottles at the officer, who shouted at her to get on the ground after one of them hit him in the arm. The woman refused to comply, however, at which point the policeman deployed his taser to subdue her. She was consequently taken into custody on charges of aggravated battery on law enforcement and felony criminal mischief. In the wake of the incident, it emerged that Kindred had been denied service at Mojo Grill before entering both restaurants in search of revenge. Number 1. Lauren Pazienza. On the night of March the 10th of 2022, an elderly New Yorker was tragically killed as a result of an unprovoked attack in the city's Chelsea neighborhood. The victim, a beloved former voice coach named Barbara Meyer Gustern, had been left critically injured after a red-headed woman approached her on the sidewalk along West 28th Street and shoved her to the ground from behind. 87-year-old Gustern's skull violently collided with the concrete below, and she remained hospitalized for about 5 days before ultimately succumbing to her head wound. The NYPD used surveillance footage to identify Gustern's attacker as Lauren Pazienza, who was arrested on 2 counts of second-degree assault. Following the victim's death, Pazienza also reportedly faced a manslaughter charge. Investigators subsequently determined that on the night of the deadly incident, Pazienza had flown into a rage after she and her fiancé were asked to leave nearby Chelsea Park because it was after closing time. The woman was alleged to have been slightly intoxicated after having consumed a few glasses of wine to celebrate their upcoming wedding. Her drunken tantrum continued after she allegedly threw food at her partner and crossed the street, at which point she shoved Gustern, with whom she had no prior association. In the immediate aftermath, Pazienza reportedly deleted her social media accounts, hid her cell phone, and fled to her parents' Long Island home, but was eventually tracked down by the authorities and thrown in jail. She was released on a $500,000 bond, but later rearrested after being deemed a serious flight risk. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office extended multiple plea deal offers to Pazienza, all of which she turned down, ensuring her case would go to trial. The court proceedings were scheduled to begin in October of 2022. On August the 11th of 2020, a pedestrian was fatally struck by a speeding car while crossing the street in San Francisco, California. The incident reportedly occurred at the intersection of Geary Boulevard and Gough Street in the city's Japantown neighborhood. 50-year-old Mark Berman, a father of 2, was the individual legally walking in a crosswalk when a passing car ran a red light and hit him. The driver responsible was identified as 26-year-old Raja Whitfield, who was arrested and charged with manslaughter, reckless driving, speeding, and entering a crosswalk on a red signal. He was booked at the San Francisco County Jail with his bond set at a reported $300,000. During a board meeting held by the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency in the accident's aftermath, it was determined that Whitfield had been traveling at speeds of up to 65 miles per hour and recording the reckless behavior for social media in the moments leading up to his collision with Berman. The stretch of road where the crash occurred had a posted speed limit of 25 miles per hour. Following Whitfield's arrest, alarming social media videos emerged in which he brazenly discussed driving 100 miles per hour in 25 miles per hour zones, joked about incriminating himself and labeled himself a street racer. Number 6. Bandre Avery. Florida man Bandre Avery returned home from a doctor's appointment on August 11th of 2021 to find his girlfriend in critical condition with a gunshot wound to her head. The 22-year-old frantically dialed 911 before turning his attention to the unconscious woman. When emergency crews arrived, they found Avery performing CPR on 21-year-old Shemaya Lim, who was subsequently pronounced dead. Investigators determined that the fatal round had been discharged from Avery's personal Glock 43 handgun, one of 4 firearms he kept in the house. The young man told officers that he normally hid the weapon next to his bed in a backpack, decorated with characters from the animated children's series Paw Patrol. As deduced by the ensuing homicide investigation, Avery and Lynn's 2-year-old son had gotten his hands on the gun after rummaging through the backpack. The young woman was at the time on a work-related Zoom call with several of her colleagues. The child inadvertently fired the weapon at her. Upon seeing Lynn slumped over in her chair with blood all over her head and face, her co-workers called 911 shortly before Avery came on the scene and did the same. For leaving a loaded weapon within a toddler's reach and for stowing it in a bag which said toddler might reasonably find attractive due to its decoration, Avery was taken into police custody on charges of manslaughter by culpable negligence and failure to securely store a firearm. Number 5. Daniel Crawshaw. On March the 7th of 2020, Yorkshireman Daniel Crawshaw got behind the wheel of his BMW coupe following a night out in which he reportedly consumed 4 pints of lager and multiple vodka lemonades. Witnesses warned him against driving in his obviously intoxicated state, but the 28-year-old disregarded them and went out into the night to meet up with a couple of friends, one of whom was 20-year-old Keegan Edgell. Crawshaw allegedly crashed into another vehicle while parking his car in Huddersfield, but nevertheless continued driving after picking up Edgell, who got into his passenger seat, and an unidentified man who got in the back. As gathered from CCTV from a nearby house, Crawshaw lost control of the BMW as he approached a bend in the road. The vehicle consequently swerved off the roadway, went over a grass verge and smashed into a wall. Crawshaw then emerged from the disabled car and rolled a cigarette before trying to get into a passing taxi. The cabbie refused to allow the man into his vehicle and dialed 999 to report the crash. When paramedics arrived at the scene, they pronounced Edgell dead. The second passenger was taken to a hospital and placed in a medically induced coma. Although his condition improved by the next day, he reportedly continued to experience symptoms including memory loss. For several months after the accident, Crawshaw was arrested in the aftermath. In November of 2022, he admitted causing death by dangerous driving and causing serious injury by dangerous driving. The following month in Leeds Crown Court, Crawshaw was sentenced to 8.5 years behind bars and was also disqualified from driving for 75 months after his release. Number 4. Lamarcus Walker. In March of 2019, a group of reckless ATV riders ran rampant throughout the streets of Nashville, Tennessee. A police affidavit identified one of the suspects as Lamarcus Walker, who was taken into custody on a charge of reckless driving in the aftermath. The document further detailed how, on the morning in question, an unnamed victim was stopped at a red light on Dickerson Pike when the rowdy group of riders came hurtling down the northbound lane on a large number of dirt bikes and ATVs, driving erratically. The victim reported seeing Walker executing a wheelie on his ATV when he suddenly lost control of the vehicle and it struck a car. Walker himself went flying, but both he and the vehicle were loaded into a black Ford pickup before the arrival of law enforcement. Moments after witnessing Walker's accident, the victim pulled out his cell phone to record the mayhem, at which point a man approached him and placed a metal object, believed to have been a firearm, up to the bystander's head. They made off with the victim's cell phone before police caught up with the pickup a short time later. While Walker and his associates denied any involvement in both the hit-and-run collision and the subsequent armed robbery, The victim positively identified them to the officers, who placed them under arrest. Another ATV driver named as Walter Moss was arrested for striking a police sergeant during the mass ride through Nashville. He consequently faced a number of charges, including aggravated assault. Number 3. Lisa Guerrino. In the early morning hours of June the 1st of 2022, Las Vegas woman Lisa Guerrino blazed through a stop sign near Centennial Parkway and North Shomba Road and slammed directly into an SUV exercising the right-of-way. 38-year-old Guerrino subsequently fled the scene on foot. Officers tracked her down to her nearby apartment, and when they spoke with her, she denied any involvement in the crash, which had resulted in the death of 37-year-old Stephen Palmetier Jr. The man's young son also needed to be hospitalized after suffering critical injuries. Guerrino's husband told the police that she'd been at Jackpot Joni's casino. In the hours before the fatal accident, investigators learned from a bartender at the casino that Guerrino had been served 6 shots of Patron Silver tequila before she got back behind the wheel. She still had an unsteady gait and seemed very confused when interacting with officers at her apartment. In September of 2022, Guerrino entered a guilty plea to charges of DUI resulted in death, DUI resulted in substantial bodily harm, reckless driving resulted in substantial bodily harm, and leaving the scene of a crash. Her sentencing was originally scheduled to take place in November, but it's unclear as of the latest updates whether her punishment had yet been handed down. Number 2. Sean Speed and Jeffrey Peer. Delaware State Troopers were called to the 5000 block of Smyrna-Leipzig Road for a report of shots fired in the early hours of September the 1st of 2019. Upon arrival, the officers were told by a local resident that a female motorist had pulled into their driveway, followed by another vehicle with multiple men inside. The parties reportedly began arguing about a prior road rage incident, and the homeowner subsequently asked them to vacate the property. Although they initially obliged, the male suspects returned a short time later and fired 2 shots in the direction of the other car. The suspect vehicle led troopers on a brief pursuit before eventually surrendering to law enforcement. The driver, 24-year-old Sean Speed, and the passenger, 43-year-old Jeffrey Peer, were both taken into custody. The former faced a plethora of charges, including disregarding a police officer signal, reckless driving, possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, and first-degree reckless endangerment. Peer was charged with reckless endangerment and conspiracy and was released after posting his $3,500 bail. Speed, on the other hand, was held in custody at the Sussex Correctional Institution on a $29,850 secured bond. Number 1. The shooting of Matthew Wilson. A shooting on the 3600 block of Buford Highway in Atlanta, Georgia claimed the life of an uninvolved bystander in a neighboring apartment complex on January the 16th of 2022. The victim was identified as Matthew Wilson, a 31-year-old astrophysicist from England who'd been visiting his girlfriend Catherine Shepard in Atlanta. The couple reportedly met while Wilson was completing postdoctoral work at Georgia State University, where Shepard was also studying. He'd only been in the States for a few short hours before the deadly incident, which occurred at about 2 a.m. Wilson and Shepard heard several shots ring out, which prompted the latter to look out the window in an attempt to locate the source of the gunfire. When she turned around, Wilson was bleeding, and his breathing was noticeably labored. She rushed him to the hospital after realizing that a stray bullet had entered their apartment through the bedroom wall and struck him in the head. The man was ultimately pronounced dead. As of the most readily available updates on the matter, investigators were still working to identify the individual or group responsible for the reckless shooting. The body of 28-year-old Mohammed Muhyiddin was found in a ditch near London's Heathrow Airport on October the 31st of 2021. He'd been fatally shot in the back, and investigators would subsequently determine that one of his friends had been responsible. 39-year-old Chirag Amir Chirag was arrested in November. He told law enforcement that he'd been asked to transport the firearm used in the killing, an Agram 2002 submachine gun fitted with a silencer, when it accidentally went off as he placed it in the back seat of a Toyota Prius. Muhyiddin, who'd been in the passenger seat, was fatally shot. Prosecutors agreed that the killing had been accidental, but would argue that Chirag had lied about his intentions with the weapon, which was readied and primed for use in an attack. He and Muhyiddin, along with several companions, had been involved in an earlier conflict with a group of men. During the altercation, another associate of theirs, Mohammed Shakil, had brandished an imitation revolver while Chirag had pulled out the Agram. Prosecutors believed that they were preparing for a ride-out against their rivals when the submachine gun went off, derailing their plans and leaving them scrambling to cover up Muhyiddin's death. By late November of 2022, Shakil had pleaded guilty to possession of an imitation firearm with intent to cause fear of violence, while a jury convicted Chirag of manslaughter and possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. An unnamed male teenager admitted perverting the course of justice for setting the Prius alight in the incident's aftermath. Subsequent developments in the case indicated that the sentencing for all three was scheduled for February the 10th of 2023. Number 6. Edward Haffey and Michael Kuhnhausen. On the evening of September the 6th of 2006, a hammer-wielding intruder ambushed Oregon nurse Susan Kuhnhausen in her South Portland home after she'd returned from work. Susan, who was at the time in her early 50s, fought relentlessly as the intruder, 59-year-old Vietnam veteran Edward Dalton Haffey, struck her repeatedly. In the ensuing struggle, the nurse managed to wrestle the claw hammer away from Haffey and swung its claw several times into his head. Susan repeatedly asked him, "Who sent you?" as she then squeezed her hands around his throat. She let go moments later and tried to flee, but Haffey caught up with her in the hallway outside her bedroom and punched her to the floor. Susan managed to pull the man down with her and repeatedly bit into his arm, thigh, flank, and even into his genitals through his zipper. She then flipped Haffey onto his stomach, hooked her arm around his neck, and applied a chokehold. The middle-aged woman tightened her forearm against his throat until he stopped moving. She fled outside with the hammer, and her neighbors called the police. Susan's fight for her life later became the focus of national news, with the Portland Police Bureau giving her its Civilian Medal of Heroism in honor of her sheer determination to survive. Haffey, who had a lengthy criminal record that included serving 9 years for conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, was pronounced dead at the scene. An autopsy revealed he'd had a nearly fatal dose of cocaine in his system at the time of attacking Susan. Haffey was regarded as a burglar who'd somehow managed to bypass the home's alarm system. A backpack he'd left at the scene would reveal that he was actually a hitman. A day planner inside the backpack had "Call Mike" written down on September the 4th, and in a folder, Haffey had jotted the cell phone number of Susan's estranged husband, Michael. Haffey had worked for the latter at his adult video store. At the time of the attempt on Susan's life, she and Michael were in the midst of a turbulent divorce. Michael, who was set to get their house in the event of Susan's death, had offered Haffey $50,000 to kill his wife and make it look like a burglary gone wrong. He'd provided him with the security code to the home, which Susan hadn't changed since he'd moved out. Michael was sentenced to 10 years in prison after pleading guilty to soliciting aggravated murder. He died of prostate cancer while incarcerated. Number 5. Kenneth Smith and John Forrest Parker. On March the 18th of 1988, Elizabeth Sennett, a 45-year-old pastor's wife from Alabama, was found dead at her Colbert County home. The woman had been bludgeoned and stabbed 8 times in the chest and once in each side of her neck. Investigators would eventually determine that her husband, Charles, had orchestrated her murder. The West Side Church of Christ pastor, who was having an affair at the time, had taken out a large insurance policy on Elizabeth and then plotted her murder in order to settle his substantial debts. Roughly a week after his wife's killing, as investigators were closing in on him as a suspect, Charles took his own life. The authorities found that he'd paid a man named Billy Gray Williams $3,000 for the hit on Elizabeth. Williams, in turn, hired 19-year-old John Forrest Parker and Kenneth Eugene Smith, aged 22, promising $1,000 to each of them. They approached Elizabeth at her home, claiming that Charles had given them permission to examine the property as a potential hunting site. Parker and Smith gained access to the house by asking to use the bathroom. Once inside, they beat Elizabeth with a galvanized pipe and knife her to death before stealing items to make it appear as if a violent burglary had occurred. Smith and Parker were tied to the killing by hair and material fibers found at the scene, as well as a VCR taken from the home that was later found at Smith's residence. Williams, the man who'd hired them, was sentenced to life without parole for his role in the brutal murder, while they were convicted of capital murder. In the legal proceedings that followed, a jury returned a verdict of life imprisonment without parole for Parker, but the trial judge overruled the verdict and sentenced him to death. He was executed via lethal injection in June of 2010. Smith was initially given the capital punishment as well, but on appeal, the jury considered his character and life circumstances as mitigating factors, ultimately voting 11-1 for a life sentence. Much like with Parker, the decision was overruled by a judge who sentenced Smith to death. In 2017, Alabama became the last state to repeal judicial override, but Smith's punishment was set to carry on. Updates indicated that he'd been granted a stay of execution as officials had failed to find a vein on his body to administer the lethal injection on November the 17th of 2022, the day he was scheduled to die. Number 4. Disappearance of Jarrett Clark. 18-year-old Jarrett Clark was reported missing in May of 2006, shortly after a graduation party at a campsite on Wahoo Bay, Oklahoma. Law enforcement tracked the location of Jarrett's phone to a dumpster in Broken Arrow, before on May the 19th his body was found floating only a few hundred yards from the party site. His lungs were filled with water, indicating he was alive upon entering the lake. There appeared to be indication of trauma on his body, but a medical examiner couldn't determine if it had originated from a beating or prolonged water exposure. The case went cold for 5 years due to a lack of evidence and actionable witness testimony, with the working theory being that an inebriated Jarrett had fallen into the lake and drowned. The toxicology report ultimately disproved that idea, and in 2012 the investigation was reopened, with Jarrett's ex-girlfriend among the first to be interviewed. The former reported that she received texts from Jarrett on the night of the party, but noted they appeared not to have been written by him. The sheriff's department began to suspect foul play. Others who joined the lakeside gathering were Anthony Wallen, Wayne Humphrey, and Brandon Hargrove, along with his older sister, Dana, and his girlfriend, Courtney Manza. Brandon died in a car accident in 2008. Upon being questioned, Courtney seemed to only vaguely recollect the events that had taken place on May the 13th, 6 years prior. She stated that Jarrett had entered a tent while she was alone inside before she heard Brandon, her boyfriend, call out his name. Dana and Anthony gave similarly muddled accounts and also changed their stories several times. Wayne Humphrey, who in 2012 was serving time for burglary and embezzlement, eventually brought clarity to the case. He reported that a conflict had sparked up between Brandon, Anthony, and Jarrett after the latter was accused of flirting with Courtney. Wayne admitted to holding Jarrett down while Anthony punched and kicked him with such force that even he felt the shock of the blows. Complementary to Wayne's report was that of a witness unassociated with the party, who remembered hearing yelling, a thud, and a splash on the night, as well as seeing a truck driving up to the boat ramp. Another witness then came forward stating that Courtney had confessed to the murder. It ultimately emerged that after the vicious beating delivered by Anthony, she, Brandon, and Dana had dumped Jarrett, who was barely alive, into the lake. It was Brandon who then sent the text to Jarrett's ex-girlfriend before disposing of his phone. Courtney and Dana entered plea deals in 2014 and agreed to testify against Anthony. Courtney was in prison for 2 years as an accessory after the fact, while Dana admitted obstruction and was handed a 2-year probated sentence. Anthony eventually pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit second-degree murder in 2016 and was sentenced to 8 years in prison and 12 years of parole. Number 3. Rebecca Palmer. British woman Rebecca Palmer from Royal Wootton Bassett, England, was jailed in October of 2017 for making false abuse claims against a soldier. The unnamed 20-year-old, who served with the King's Royal Hussars in Tidworth, had had consensual relations with Palmer, after which he rejected a prospective relationship with her. Enraged, Palmer then embarked on a malicious campaign of framing him for abuse and harassment. She sent malicious communications to the victim, his friends, and members of his family. She created multiple fake friend profiles on social media and fabricated conversations which she hoped would be accepted as evidence of her claims. Adding to her list of machinations, Palmer had also falsely stated that the victim had posted intimate photos of her on Facebook. Her accusations resulted in the soldier being arrested on multiple occasions, questioned extensively, and held in custody for periods of time. After the man had initially made bail, Palmer told the police that he'd breached the conditions of his release by stalking and harassing her. She lied that she'd become pregnant and lost a baby following an attempt to take her own life. A web of lies eventually unraveled, and the fake abuse case came to light. When it did, others who'd previously interacted with the woman, then in her mid-20s, would characterize her as having always behaved like a vile, lying bully. Following her arrest, Palmer pleaded guilty to 5 offenses of malicious communications and 3 offenses of perverting the course of public justice. She was jailed for 5 years and later tried to appeal the sentence. Her lawyers claimed that the original punishment had been excessive and hadn't considered Palmer's severe mental health difficulties, which reportedly stemmed from her personality disorders and being kicked in the head by a horse as a child. The appeal was, however, rejected as 3 judges found there was nothing wrong with her sentence. Number 2. Fa Ziying and Lao Rongji. From 1996 to 1999, Chinese couple Fa Ziying and Lao Rongji were responsible for a string of kidnappings, robberies, and murders carried out in Nanchang, Wenzhou, Changzhou, and Hefei. They killed 7 people before Fa was arrested in July of 1999. While he was collecting a ransom at the home of their last victim, he was executed later that same year. Fa had lied to the police during his interviews and thus helped Lao, his serial killer partner, evade capture. The woman remained on the run for roughly 2 decades. She reportedly had surgery to change her appearance and used multiple aliases to travel through the country. Lao made a living by working part-time in bars and other entertainment venues and changed cities before suspicions could arise, an existence which she'd describe as living in darkness. She was eventually identified as a fugitive and arrested in November of 2019 while she was working under an alias and selling watches at a mall in Xiamen. During a subsequent hearing, she reported that her involvement in the spree only extended to luring the victims and robbing them, while Fa handled the violence. Lao also reported that she'd been an unwilling participant in the spree and that she'd been coerced through abuse by her boyfriend, whose methods she described as very cruel. The court, however, held her responsible for 2 deaths and found that she'd been directly involved in 5 killings. She was sentenced to death on September the 9th of 2021 and promptly appealed the decision. Number 1. Taylor Renee Parker. On the morning of October the 9th of 2020, law enforcement in New Boston, Texas, conducted a traffic stop after witnessing a woman later identified as Taylor Renee Parker speeding and driving erratically. Officers discovered that Parker, who was then in her late 20s, appeared to have just given birth. She told the police that she'd had her baby by the side of the road and that the child wasn't breathing. They were both rushed to the McCurtain Memorial Hospital in Idabel, Oklahoma. The baby girl was pronounced dead on arrival, and suspicions arose when Parker refused to be checked out by staff. A horrific discovery soon followed. In a bid to keep her boyfriend from leaving her, Parker had faked a pregnancy for roughly 10 months leading up to the incident. Her elaborate lie included wearing pregnancy disguises in real life and in her social media posts, faking ultrasounds and even having a gender reveal party. Then, on October the 9th, she went to the New Boston home of her pregnant friend, Reagan Simmons Hancock, aged 21. Parker ambushed the woman, stabbed her over 100 times, and crushed her skull with a hammer. Simmons Hancock was still alive when Parker cut her with a scalpel from hip to hip and ripped her daughter from her womb. She then fled the house with the child, intending to pass her off as her own, and left Simmons Hancock's other daughter, aged 3, alone with her as she bled to death. Evidence indicated that Parker had extensively researched how to fake a pregnancy online and how to deliver babies preterm at 35 weeks, which was how far along Simmons Hancock was when she killed her. Parker was arrested after the victim's body was discovered, and she was ultimately found guilty of capital murder, for which she was sentenced to death in November of 2022. Number 7. Kayla Mendoza. On the night of November the 16th of 2013, Florida woman Kayla Mendoza accompanied some of her co-workers from her job at a T-Mobile US store to the Tijuana Taxi Co., a local bar in Coral Springs. According to subsequent reports, the 20-year-old woman drank 2 fishbowl margaritas over the course of the next several hours. At some point during the evening, Mendoza made a post to her Twitter account in which she had stated, "Too drunk to care." It was later detailed how she regularly posted similar quotes to her social media profiles that suggested she suffered from an addiction to alcohol as well as other substances. Although the drinks she'd consumed at the bar had left her severely intoxicated, Mendoza got behind the wheel of her then-boyfriend's Hyundai Sonata in order to drive home a few hours later. The young woman then traveled down the Sawgrass Expressway in the wrong direction and at speeds of up to 80 miles per hour before colliding with a 2012 Toyota Camry occupied by Caitlin Ferranti and Marissa Catronio, both aged 21. The violent crash, which occurred at about 1:45 a.m., instantly killed Catronio, while Ferranti passed away in the hospital a few days later. Mendoza broke both her legs in the collision and was consequently confined to a wheelchair for over a year. She was arrested and charged with several offenses, including 2 counts of DUI manslaughter while impaired. In 2015, Mendoza pleaded guilty to her charges and shortly thereafter was sentenced to 24 years in federal prison. She was ordered to serve 6 years of probation following her release and was also permanently banned from operating a motor vehicle. Number 6. Davis Allen Cripe. In April of 2017, South Carolina teenager Davis Allen Cripe collapsed during one of his classes at Spring Hill High School. Paramedics were dispatched to the scene and Cripe was taken to the hospital, where he was later pronounced dead after having suffered a cardiac event causing a probable arrhythmia. It subsequently emerged that Cripe had consumed several highly caffeinated beverages in the hours leading up to the incident. According to the Richland County coroner, the teen had drunk a latte from McDonald's, a large Mountain Dew, and an unidentified energy drink within a 2-hour time frame. Although Cripe was described as healthy and reportedly exhibited no signs of a pre-existing heart condition, the excessive amount of caffeine in his system, ingested over such a short period of time, ultimately triggered his fatal cardiac episode. In subsequent reports, it was detailed how the 200-pound teen had consumed approximately 470 milligrams of caffeine on the day in question. In 2015, the European Food Safety Authority stated that drinking more than 400 milligrams during a 24-hour period could lead to increased heart rate, higher blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, tremors, nervousness, insomnia, and panic attacks. Number 5. Ryan Austin Martin. Florida police were called to the Orlando International Airport on February the 24th of 2022 after receiving reports of a belligerent flyer in the midst of what was described as a chaotic meltdown. When officers arrived at the scene, they came upon New York resident Ryan Austin Martin, who was traveling with his wife and daughter. According to eyewitness testimony, 34-year-old Martin had gotten into a physical altercation with his family and ultimately needed to be separated from them by airport security. He also allegedly attacked an airline employee during the course of his public outburst. The incident, which was captured on cell phone video by witnesses at the scene, culminated with Martin being tasered a total of 7 times by the police. Despite law enforcement's efforts to subdue him, the heavy-set man continued behaving aggressively. Additional officers eventually got to the airport, at which point Martin was detained and taken to Orange County Jail. He reportedly faced charges of child abuse, battery involving domestic violence, resisting an officer with violence, and disorderly intoxication. In the wake of the incident, it emerged that Martin had consumed several alcoholic beverages leading up to his meltdown, which investigators identified as a contributing factor to his unrelentingly aggressive behavior. Number 4. Jennifer Strange. California radio station KDND sponsored an on-air water drinking contest, for which the prize was a Nintendo Wii video game console. On January the 12th of 2007, the challenge's participants competed to see which of them could consume the most water without urinating. One of the contestants, a mother of 3 from Sacramento named Jennifer Strange, drank approximately 1.5 gallons of water during the competition. Later on, the 28-year-old woman reportedly told the radio hosts that she was suffering from an intense headache. The DJs reacted by laughing at her, however, and even told the woman that her distended stomach, another side effect of the excessive water intake, made her look pregnant. After finishing in second place for the contest, Strange left the station and called one of her supervisors at the Radiological Associates of Sacramento to say that she wasn't feeling well and was going home for the day. Hours later, the woman was found dead after having suffered hyponatremia, which occurs when the concentration of sodium in one's blood is abnormally low. Strange's family subsequently filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the radio station, which fired 10 of its employees in the incident's wake. During the lawsuit's court proceedings, a kidney expert testified that by drinking too much water, Strange had disrupted her body's salt balance, causing her cells as well as her brain to swell. The jury ultimately awarded a $16.5 million payout to the woman's family. Number 3. Gemma Payne. 24-year-old English woman Gemma Payne was arrested in the afternoon of September the 26th of 2019 after a police officer had witnessed her punch a man while intoxicated. The incident occurred only hours after Payne had been released from the custody of West Midlands Police in connection to what was described as a similar offense. In September of the following year, the young woman was arrested for drunkenly assaulting a police constable who was acting in the exercise of her duties as an emergency worker. In March of 2021, it was reported that Payne was involved in a domestic violence incident. Court records indicated that she'd flown into a fit of rage after her girlfriend had refused the inebriated woman access to her home. Payne then forced her way inside and threw a pair of shoes at the victim before repeatedly striking her in the head. During her trial, Payne reportedly told the court that she had no recollection of the attack due to her having been acutely intoxicated at the time. Her overindulgence in alcohol had led to more than 10 criminal convictions for instances in which she was drunk and disorderly. Number 2. The black licorice overdose. In September of 2020, a case study was published in the New England Journal of Medicine that centered on the story of a man who died by eating too much black licorice. The medical report only identified the individual as a 54-year-old construction worker from Massachusetts. He had developed a habit of consuming 2 large bags of the black-colored confection every day for 3 weeks back in January of 2019. The excessive amount of licorice, which naturally contains a toxin called glyceric acid, reportedly caused the man's potassium levels to plummet. While he was eating at a fast food restaurant, he abruptly went into cardiac arrest and lost consciousness. Paramedics arrived at the scene within minutes and managed to revive him using 4 electric shocks and CPR. Approximately 30 minutes later, the man was admitted to a local hospital. Medical staff subsequently determined that he'd suffered from multiple organ system failure, profound metabolic derangements, dangerously low levels of potassium in his blood, and cardiac arrest associated with ventricular fibrillation. It was ultimately concluded that each of his medical complications had stemmed from his extreme overindulgence of black licorice. Despite the best efforts of his doctors, the man passed away about 32 hours after his initial hospital admittance. Number 1. Artie Lang. Comedian Artie Lang, best known for his tenure on the famed Howard Stern-led radio show, made headlines in May of 2019 after he was arrested for an alleged probation violation. Officers from the Essex County Sheriff's Office in New Jersey had taken the former television personality into custody at a halfway house in Clinton on the morning of May the 21st. Although Lang reportedly looked sober and appeared to be coherent when interacting with law enforcement, he was ultimately deemed to not be in compliance with his drug rehabilitation program. Subsequent reports detailed how traces of both cocaine and morphine had been detected in his system, which was a clear violation of the probation associated with his 2017 drug possession conviction. The attention generated by Lang's latest run-in with the law was partially attributed to his deformed appearance in his mugshot, which went viral online. In it, the man exhibited obvious signs of saddle nose, a deformity caused by trauma to the septum. The condition is reportedly common among drug abusers who've repeatedly overindulged in substances ingested through the nose. Beverly Hills plastic surgeon Paul Nassif, who rose to prominence by co-hosting the reality series Botched with Terry Dubrow, publicly stated that he'd be willing to mend Lang's nose if he was committed to permanently refrain from abusing illegal substances. Number 8. Anna Miliutzik. On September the 10th of 2019, Anna Miliutzik was working a pillar drill at a facility operated by P&D Engineering Limited in Coventry, England. Miliutzik, then in her mid-20s, was distracted by a loud crash produced by one of the other machines and turned her head. As she did so, her ponytail got caught in the drill. Miliutzik was too far from the off handle and she tried yanking her head forward, but was powerless to oppose the rapidly rotating tool. Her screams went unanswered in the commotion generated by the machines at the industrial site. Before the young woman passed out, she heard the harrowing and haunting sound of her scalp being torn off, which she later likened to that of tape being pulled away from skin. She survived the accident but had to have 9 operations in the aftermath and lost her left ear. Health and safety officials launched an investigation which swiftly determined that her employer had been at fault. According to industry practices, the rotating parts of the drill should have been fitted with a guard. While conducting its own risk assessment for the drill, P&D Engineering Limited had found that it required protective implements but nevertheless operated it without them. The company admitted to breaching a safety act and was fined nearly $75,000. Number 7. Alexandra Diaz. In October of 2021, Michelle Yee was teaching a Pilates class along Arizona Avenue in Santa Monica, California. As her students were beginning to arrive, the 37-year-old, who in 2007 had appeared on the reality TV series Survivor, noticed a disheveled and agitated woman approaching the open front door of her studio. The woman, who appeared to be homeless, reportedly started screaming at Yee that she'd stolen her identity and accused her of being an escort. Yee told the stranger that she needed to leave, but was then attacked by her with a rusty saw blade and a metal baton. The former reality contestant was slashed on the left bicep with the blade and then struck in the head with the baton. The attacker, subsequently identified as 25-year-old Alexandra Diaz, fled the scene. Yee students tried to call 911 but were reportedly told that all the operators were busy before they ultimately managed to flag down a passing patrol car. Yee, whose face had been left bloodied in the attack, drove to the hospital where her injuries weren't deemed life-threatening and she received several stitches for a gash above her left eyebrow. Diaz, whom the authorities suspected suffered from mental illness and hadn't taken her treatment, was arrested later that same day and charged with 3 counts of assault with a deadly weapon. She had reportedly attacked 2 other people, inflicting cuts and bruises, but both of the victims declined medical attention. Her mugshot was released in the aftermath and attracted attention online, particularly due to the seemingly desperate expression on Diaz's face. Number 6. Matthew Peters. In the fall of 2021, Australian man Matthew Peters went viral on TikTok after sharing a remarkably close call involving an angle grinder. The power tool, used for cutting and polishing as well as sharpening metal tools, featured sharp-edged rotating discs. As Peters was working with the grinder, half a disc broke off and flew directly towards his head. Fortunately, the man was wearing a face shield at the time. The fragment cut through the plastic and stopped within less than an inch from his eye. Peters didn't elaborate on the exact circumstances of the incident during his video, which was viewed over 55 million times. He did, however, record the angle grinder, which still had half of the disc attached to it, before switching to himself as he had the face shield on, with the other half embedded in the plastic. Some of the users commented on the video remarked how fortunate Peters had been, while others quipped that it was time for him to find another job. Number 5. Mary Leong. A video of an incident in the Chatsworth neighborhood of Los Angeles went viral in June of 2020, and it showed a woman subsequently branded a racist, hammer-wielding Karen attacking her neighbor's parked car. Social media identified the perpetrator as 72-year-old Chatsworth resident Mary Leong, who, armed with 2 hammers, began striking the vehicle for reportedly no other reason than her disdain for its owner, Edie Perez. He was in Miami at the time, and the video was reportedly captured by his sister. Once she was done attacking the car, Leong walked up to the latter with the hammers in hand and told her that they should get out of the neighborhood. Perez's sister backed away and replied that she was going to call the police. Leong stormed off and later struck a garbage container with the hammers before kicking and dumping it on Perez's lawn, exclaiming, "Go back to Mexico." A second video showed Leong in an altercation with a female neighbor who'd grabbed her by the hair and was pressing her head down, but their dispute remained unclear. Perez received the clip of Leong denting his car and shared it online, reaffirming his hatred of racists. He detailed that since moving next door to the elderly woman, he and his roommate had been subjected to repeated racially charged verbal abuse. Leong was arrested on June the 10th but released the following day amid concerns over the spread of COVID-19. Number 4. Terry Gregory. Colorado builder Terry Gregory started destroying a bathroom he'd finished remodeling in September of 2021 after a payment dispute with the homeowner who'd hired him. Amber Truck had contracted Dream Home Remodels to work on the project and had already paid $3,330 of an owed $7,555. She reportedly wanted to inspect the bathroom and make sure the water was running properly before handing over the rest of the money. After announcing that he'd completed the job, Gregory told her that she had 24 hours to complete the payment. Truck was at work when Gregory, along with his wife and his business partner named as Jordan Cazares, returned to the address. Before entering the home, the builder flashed a middle finger to Truck's doorbell camera. The lack of immediate payment had enraged Gregory, who then used a sledgehammer to strike the tiles he'd previously put up, leaving a mess of smashed debris throughout the room. A neighbor filmed the destruction, which Gregory punctuated by yelling, "Is somebody going to pay me?" The neighbor repeatedly asked the man to stop and pointed to the fact that it wasn't his home to wreck. The trio then left the premises, and in early November, warrants were put out for Gregory and Cazares' arrest on charges of Class 3 felony burglary and Class 6 criminal mischief. A few days later, they were booked into custody in Gunnison County and subsequently released on bond. The story made national news, and Truck's plight drew sympathy from other contractors who offered to remodel her bathroom for free. Number 3. Hannah Walker. After a shopping trip, Chicago teenager Jasmine Weir and her friends decided to have dinner at a McDonald's near North State Street and West Chicago Avenue in June of 2018. While there, an argument about their place in line ensued between Weir's group and 36-year-old Hannah Walker. She reportedly started bumping into the teens while also yelling at them. As tensions escalated, Walker brandished a tool described by Weir as a handyman hammer from her purse. In the commotion, Weir stumbled forward, at which point Walker struck her in the head just inches above her right eye with the hammer. The teenager, who didn't remember the moments that followed the attack, spent the night at a local hospital, where she was given stitches but wasn't reported to have suffered long-term damage. The authorities arrived at the scene within minutes of the attack and found that Walker had made her way behind the counter while still wielding the hammer. Officers recovered the weapon, and the woman was taken into custody on charges of misdemeanor battery causing bodily harm. Number 2. Portland physics teacher. Cell phone footage from a high school in Portland, Oregon went viral in the spring of 2015 after a physics experiment failed in a dramatic and cringing fashion. The unnamed physics teacher lay on his back with a plank of nails pressed against his chest and a cinder block on top of it. The teacher reportedly aimed to demonstrate the effect of inertia by having a co-worker hit the cinder block with the blunt head of an axe. A popular experiment, albeit not in a school setting, it was meant to demonstrate that the cinder block would absorb the energy of the strike by breaking apart, and thus person at the bottom would barely feel the impact. The second man raised the axe above his head, but as he came down with it, only clipped the block and struck the physics teacher directly in the groin. In spite of the latter visibly writhing in pain, the assistant hit the block a second time, partially shattering it. The teacher, seemingly shaken up, rose to his feet before the video cut out. Teenager Hanif Mubarak, a student in the class who'd captured a second video of the incident, subsequently confirmed in a Reddit comment that the teacher was all right, but quipped that he walked funny for like a couple of days. Mubarak added that in spite of the original viral video being titled how the physics teacher lost his job, the man retained his position at the high school. Number 1. Ian Horsley. On February the 23rd of 2019, Welshman Ian Horsley was helping clear out a neighbour's woodshed in his home village of Rosemarket, Milford Haven. Horsley was putting material into a power chop saw when his hand got caught on the blade. Still in shock, the 61-year-old remembered seeing something flying through the air in front of him. Within moments, he realised that it was his hand, and as he later told a media outlet, his world fell apart. The saw had cut through his hand, leaving only the thumb attached. He and a friend called an ambulance, but unsure of when it would arrive, they decided to drive to Withybush Hospital in Haverfordwest, about 15 minutes away. They arrived at the emergency room with the severed hand in the back seat, and Horsley was transferred to a hospital in Swansea. He was placed in surgery with doctors intending to use veins and tendons from his leg to reattach the hand. They ended up not needing the graft and were successful in sewing it back together, apart from Horsley's little finger, which the man would in hindsight describe as a small price to pay. Within 6 months of the surgery, after many physiotherapy and occupational therapy sessions, the self-employed handyman had already regained some considerable mobility in his hand. Alabama woman Rachel Camille Calhoun attempted to rob a branch of Regions Bank in the 1300 block of Tomahawk Road in Forestdale shortly before 10 a.m. on June the 6th of 2018. The 24-year-old reportedly handed the manager a note demanding $6,000 in cash from the vault. Calhoun's note indicated that if she received the money without incident, the manager would be rewarded with an intimate favor. If her demand was refused, the young woman said she'd falsely accused the manager of assault. As Calhoun was still waiting for the money inside the branch, deputies from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office arrived and took her into custody. She was charged with first-degree attempted extortion and first-degree attempted theft. Number 7. Donna Sparks and George Davis. The police in Lockland, Ohio, were called to a home on South Wayne Avenue after receiving reports of shots fired on the premises in the early morning hours of May the 10th of 2020. 42-year-old Mohammed Ndiaye was found dead in front of his house, having suffered apparent gunshot wounds. Following an investigation into the matter, law enforcement arrested Donna Sparks, an escort and paid acquaintance of Ndiaye's. The 26-year-old woman had reportedly been at the house prior to the outbreak of gunfire and had been planning to rob the victim with an accomplice, George Davis, aged 32. Shortly before the botched robbery turned shooting, Sparks sent Davis a text message indicating the victim had a firearm. Both suspects were booked at the Hamilton County Justice Center while awaiting trial for murder. Sparks ultimately pleaded guilty to manslaughter and armed robbery charges, for which she received a 6-year prison sentence. Meanwhile, Davis, the one who gunned down both Ndiaye and his dog, was found guilty of felony murder, felonious assault, aggravated robbery, and a weapons offense. He was consequently handed down a prison sentence of 25 years to life. Number 6. Mermaid Waters robbery. A man from Mermaid Waters, a suburb of the Australian city of Gold Coast, rushed home on the afternoon of August the 23rd of 2022 after receiving an alert that his home security alarm had been triggered. Upon arrival, the man encountered a trio of teens who'd broken into his house, one of whom was armed with a knife and making threats. One of the suspects, a 16-year-old female, got behind the wheel of a stolen Hyundai and tried to flee, but the homeowner's 70-year-old stepfather ran outside and attempted to block her path out of the driveway. She subsequently struck the elderly man and sped off, leaving her 2 accomplices, both identified as teenage males, behind. The stepfather needed to be hospitalized for the injuries he sustained in the collision, which was captured on surveillance footage. Meanwhile, the 2 teen boys were arrested on charges of armed robbery in company and unlawful use of a motor vehicle. The older suspect, an 18-year-old, also faced a count of possessing a knife in public. In the incident's immediate aftermath, law enforcement indicated they knew who the female suspect was and would be seeking to bring her into custody as well. Number 5. Blade Patterson. In January of 2018, a drug-addicted man from New South Wales, Australia, entered a 7-Eleven in Berkeley, a suburb of Wollongong, with the intention of carrying out a robbery. As shown in CCTV footage that later went viral, the suspect, identified as Blade Patterson, was allowed into the store through its secured doors, then tried to hold the place up, threatening the attendant with a knife. The employee, who was protected by a layer of stainless steel wiring, retreated into the back office and locked the door, leaving Patterson alone in the store. The suspect subsequently tried to leave, only to realize that the doors had locked and he was trapped inside. For the next 10 minutes, Patterson frantically tried to find a way out, at one point attempting to gain access to the roof, to no avail. When police arrived, they ordered him onto the ground and took him into custody. His knife was reportedly found in a trash bin inside the store. Patterson later said he'd been so high at the time of the robbery he didn't even remember it. He expressed great remorse for his actions, and a judge delayed his sentencing to allow him to continue with an intensive rehabilitation program. Number 4. George Kinnear. 63-year-old Roseanne Gibson was working in a newsagent with her nephew when a man with a hammer attempted to rob them one day in December of 2021. As the balaclava-clad suspect demanded the Glasgow store's cash, Gibson's nephew leapt over the counter and tackled him to the ground. The woman then rushed over to assist and immediately unmasked the robber, whom she recognized as a previous customer. CCTV caught the dramatic confrontation, which culminated with Gibson and her nephew, 26-year-old Christopher Brown, pinning the suspect to the ground and holding him until the arrival of law enforcement. In the aftermath of the botched robbery, police identified the would-be thief as George Kinnear, an armed forces veteran. The man admitted attempted robbery and threatened violence at Glasgow Crown Court. When footage of the incident circulated online, Gibson, a grandmother, was widely lauded for her efforts to stop the armed criminal, as was her nephew. In September of 2022, 45-year-old Kinnear was jailed for 30 months as a consequence for the crime. Number 3. Sierra Barber and Garrett Gage. A violent home invasion unfolded in the 1900 block of South 16th Street in Waco, Texas, on February the 3rd of 2015. According to the resulting arrest affidavit, 20-year-old Sierra Barber drove 2 associates to the apartment in question to carry out a robbery. Subsequent reports indicated that drugs had been the criminals' target that night when the 2 armed suspects, identified as Garrett Gage and Keith William McClure, entered the residence. They encountered a total of 8 people inside. One of the residents grabbed a rifle and opened fire on the suspects, who promptly fled. McClure was struck by a bullet as he tried to leave. So too was one of the home's occupants, 20-year-old Braden Freeman, who was caught in the line of fire. McClure collapsed in the parking lot and later succumbed to his gunshot wounds, as did Freeman. Gage was arrested when police caught up with him several blocks away from the apartment. Barber, who'd stayed in the car during the course of the home invasion, was also taken into police custody. At the onset of the investigation, authorities believed that McClure had fired the shots that killed Freeman, but it was later concluded that both the victims and McClure's wounds had been inflicted by the resident with the rifle, identified as Chance Heffelfinger. The latter wasn't charged for either man's death, however, as it was determined he'd been acting in self-defense. Initially, Barber and Gage were facing capital murder charges for the bungled robbery attempt. In May of 2017, they pleaded guilty to lesser charges of aggravated robbery, for which Barber was sentenced to 30 years in state prison and Gage was sentenced to 40 years. Number 2. Oak Park home invasion. On the night of April the 1st of 2022, California man Sal Mercado returned to his Oak Park home to find a car he didn't recognize parked out front. As Mercado later told the press, he encountered a pair of male burglars upon entering the house. One of the suspects managed to flee and escape in the waiting vehicle, while the other, identified as Alexis Provost Aranguiz, was forced to endure the home owner's wrath alone. As Aranguiz made his way down the stairs with handfuls of jewelry and electronics, Mercado unleashed a major beatdown on him. While law enforcement later described the incident as a physical confrontation between the 2 men, Aranguiz's resulting mugshot displayed the full extent of the severe facial injuries Mercado had inflicted. The burglar was charged with felony conspiracy and first-degree residential burglary, with the special allegation that the burglary was a violent crime. Aranguiz, a Chilean national,
was believed to be a member of a South American theft group known for sending burglars to the US to steal from citizens and then return to their home countries in a trend investigators called crime tourism. The suspect, whose accomplices successfully escaped, pleaded not guilty to his crimes and was held in custody on a $150,000 bond. We have more similar cases lined up for you from our previous release on When ATMs Go Wrong. Stay tuned after number 1 if you'd like. Number 1. Quentel LeKelvrick Moultrie and Taylor Manjares. At around 4:30 p.m. on December the 29th of 2021, 3 individuals met at Ralph Carter Park next to Rimfire Elementary in Palm Coast, Florida, to negotiate a drug deal. Quentel LeKelvrick Moultrie and Taylor Renee Manjares were reportedly discussing the potential transaction with a 26-year-old man identified as Daniel G.M. Eventually, Moultrie and Manjares accompanied the latter back to his parents' house on Regent Lane, which was less than a mile away from the park. Manjares entered the residence to use the bathroom, and while she was inside, Danielle reportedly flashed a large sum of cash in front of her. She subsequently left with Moultrie, who continued negotiating with Danielle via text over the course of the evening. Shortly after 9 p.m., Moultrie and Manjares picked up 23-year-old Zaire Roberts, who'd been released from prison 3 months earlier after serving 7 years for a shooting that occurred in 2015. The trio went back to the Regent Lane home, which they planned to rob. Manjares called Danielle from the car outside in an attempt to distract him as Moultrie and Roberts entered the house armed with guns. They ambushed Danielle, who grabbed a Glock firearm from his sock drawer, leading to an exchange of fire. The resident was struck in the hip and leg but managed to incapacitate Roberts, prompting Moultrie to flee. The latter fired a round at the house before speeding off with Manjares. Danielle called 911, telling the dispatcher he'd been robbed and shot. While he ultimately survived the ordeal, Roberts wasn't so lucky. He succumbed to his gunshot wounds, and the following day Manjares was arrested after a traffic stop. Both she and Moultrie, who was likewise taken into custody, were forced to face the legal consequences for their accomplice's death, even though they hadn't been the ones to inflict his fatal wounds. They were charged with second-degree murder and armed burglary. In January of 2023, Moultrie was sentenced to 10 years in prison in connection with an unrelated assault. But as of that development, the murder case was still pending.
Number 8. 2013 UK ATM heist. Throughout 2013, a British gang perpetrated a series of robberies that involved blowing up ATMs to get to the cash inside, marking the first time that such tactics have been used in the UK. The men carried out an estimated 30 attacks, targeting ATMs at banks, mostly in rural areas. In the northwestern Midlands of England, they'd used crowbars to pry open the machines and then inserted a tube through which they released a mixture of oxygen and acetylene, which was then sparked. The powerful explosions also damaged the buildings, but fortunately, no one was hurt. After the blast, the gang would force their way into the bank itself and retrieve the cash before driving off in high-performance cars, which were clocked in at speeds of up to 190 miles per hour. Some of the raids were captured by surveillance footage, but the getaway vehicles had cloned plates, which is why the authorities faced difficulty in tracking them. The gang, whose heists were compared by the media to those in the Fast and Furious franchise, stole over $1 million, while also causing a nearly equivalent amount in damages. After an investigation lasting close to a year, the police were ultimately able to locate their safe house through a tracker that had been fitted to the cash box from one of the machines. As the case unfolded, the authorities retrieved some of the materials which the gang had used, including a stolen and resprayed Audi, and also found abundant forensic evidence. Roughly a dozen men were arrested in the aftermath and charged with conspiracy to cause explosions and conspiracy to commit burglary, for which they were given sentences ranging from 13 to 19 years. In March of 2014, Kurt Beddoes and Craig Cartwright, both in their 30s, admitted to their roles as ringleaders of an operation that would inspire other similar heists in the UK. They were each sentenced to 17 years in prison. The most recent arrest related to the case was Adam Murphy, apprehended in February of 2021, and subsequently handed down a sentence of 15 years. Number 7. Charles Omar McGee. Within moments of making a withdrawal from an ATM in May of 2017, a Tampa woman was robbed. On the first of the month, the victim, whose identity wasn't released, had the cash in hand after taking out of the machine at Amscott Financial on Florida Avenue at around 1:40 a.m. A man who would later be identified as 43-year-old Charles Omar McGee had been standing behind her and waited until she completed the transaction. McGee then lunged in and grabbed the money out of the woman's hand. She desperately tried holding onto it and nearly fell when McGee began to overpower her. As shown by security cameras, another woman was at an ATM next to them but didn't intervene. She continued to operate the machine and only stepped back when McGee pushed his victim in her direction. McGee then walked out with the money but was arrested later that same week after local law enforcement had released the surveillance footage. Number 6. Tamara Sinclair. In late February of 2021, a former Miss Jamaica contestant died from injuries sustained in an attack at an ATM in the Bronx borough of New York City. On February the 11th, Tamara Sinclair, age 43, was inside a TD Bank vestibule when another woman, later identified as 21-year-old Rain Harney, started banging on the glass, asking Sinclair to let her inside. The former beauty queen was frightened by the encounter and refused to do so. She then went across the street to a Bank of America, but Harney went after her. According to Sinclair's younger sister, who wasn't present at the scene, she tried to disengage, telling her pursuer, "I don't know you." A verbal argument ensued that escalated, resulted in Harney and two of her female friends, Frances Morales and Chanel Arroyo, attacking Sinclair. She was punched, kicked, and stomped on. One of the women stole her phone while the other took her wallet and gave it to Harney to rifle through. A security guard reportedly broke up the brutal beating and called the authorities. Sinclair filed a police report on February the 17th and a few days later went to the Montefiore Medical Center complaining of chest and head pain. Doctors told her that the attack had resulted in the formation of dangerous blood clots, but Sinclair refused further treatment as she was worried that she wouldn't be able to cover the cost. After she returned home, Sinclair couldn't eat or sleep and on February the 22nd, died in front of her sister. Harney was arrested along with Morales and Arroyo, both in their early 20s, and all three were charged with murder and robbery. Number 5. Ashanti Slater and Isis Wallace. In August of 2020, over the course of a single week, teenagers Ashanti Slater and Isis Wallace robbed people at the same ATM in Edinburgh, Texas, on 2 separate occasions. On August the 24th, an unnamed woman had withdrawn $600 from a Chase Bank ATM. She was approached by a woman believed to have been either Wallace or Slater, who was wearing dark clothing and a black gator-style mask. The robber brandished a silver object, which the victim thought to be a handgun, and she consequently handed over the money. Around the time of the incident, neighborhood surveillance cameras captured a silver Nissan speeding away with its lights off. On August the 30th, at around 11:15, Wallace attacked a woman who'd withdrawn $60 from the same ATM through the driver's side window of her vehicle. The victim's husband got out of the car and chased after Wallace, who ran from the scene and was picked up by Slater. By that time, police had already been searching for 2 African-American females in a silver car in connection to the first robbery. Slater and Wallace, both 18 at the time, were stopped near McCall and University. A search was conducted and an officer found marijuana in their car. Wallace waived her rights and verbally implicated herself to the robbery on the 24th, pointing to Slater as her accomplice. Both were arrested and charged with aggravated robbery, and possession of marijuana. Number 4. ATM explosion kills thief. At the time of the George Floyd protests starting in late May of 2020, dozens of ATMs were blown up, vandalized, or stolen entirely by looters in Philadelphia. The police deemed it an organized and coordinated effort. Outside Blue Jay Restaurant at 29th Street and Girard Avenue in Brewery Town, an ATM was blown up twice in consecutive days. The thieves hadn't been able to get to the cash the first time around, but were successful on the second try, as local law enforcement still struggled to contain the chaos that had gripped the streets. In another case, a burglar suffered fatal injuries after using explosives to try and pry open one of the machines. On June the 2nd, the would-be thief, only identified as a 24-year-old man, placed an improvised bomb in a sidewalk-facing ATM outside a sports bar along North 2nd Street, near Susquehanna Avenue. It's unclear if he'd misjudged the blast radius or hadn't allowed himself enough time to get clear. He was impacted by the explosion and suffered trauma to his upper body. The man was rushed to a nearby hospital but passed away a few hours later. Number 3. James Fairburn and Stuart Penny. Between October of 2017 and February of the following year, James Fairburn and Stuart Penny targeted several ATMs housed at businesses in northeast England. The men, both in their mid-30s, had been connected to 7 attacks in Bradford, Keighley, Huddersfield and Darlington, as well as to 2 cases of auto theft for the vehicles they'd used to carry out the heists. Fairburn and Penny would pump gas into the machines, then triggered explosions that severely damaged the buildings where they were located, which mainly consisted of convenience stores and gas stations. While no one was hurt, the blast frightened communities and economically impacted business owners in the neighborhoods where they occurred. The robbers stole the equivalent of over $400,000. Their last heist was at a store in Bradford where the explosion tore the door and roof off the annex where the ATM was housed. Pieces of brickwork were sent flying into people's gardens. Fairburn and Penny presumably fled in a panic as they abandoned their tools, which consisted of 2 gas canisters hooked to a car battery with tubes that fed into the ATM. The evidence contributed to the investigation, and the police eventually conducted a search of their addresses, where they found hundreds of thousands of pounds in cash and mobile phones. Fairburn and Penny were arrested in February of 2018. They subsequently admitted their guilt at Leeds Crown Court, after which in 2021 they were sentenced to 12 and 14.5 years, respectively. Number 2. Anne Nguyen and Joshua Puckett. In 2015, a man and a woman from Frisco, Texas, were taken into custody by local authorities following a robbery and assault that occurred on December the 8th. Anne Nguyen and Joshua Puckett, both in their late 20s, followed an unnamed 38-year-old woman after she'd taken money out of an ATM at a 7-Eleven in 7950 Gaylord Parkway. As she returned to her car in the parking lot of an apartment complex, Nguyen and Puckett attacked her. Puckett struck her multiple times in the head with a dark-colored handgun before the pair made off with her handbag. Both were arrested in the aftermath and charged with aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon, and each held on a $100,000 bond. Number 1. Utrecht Gang. In the fall of 2021, law enforcement in Germany and the Netherlands cooperated to take down a gang that had set up an illegal training facility in Europe, teaching would-be thieves how to blow up ATMs. The criminal operation even involved filming tutorials. The cross-border investigation unfolded over the course of 18 months and culminated in 9 arrests. The suspects had been ordering different ATM models, which were transported to their hideout in Utrecht, the Netherlands, then experimented and tried to find the most effective way to open them. They would then hand the training videos in person to other robbers. In 2020, a test went awry and the main suspect, only identified as a 29-year-old man, was killed in the explosion, while his 24-year-old accomplice sustained serious injuries. The investigation had commenced after police in Osnabrück, Germany, reported suspicious ATM orders from a local company. The gang was subsequently linked to at least 15 cash machine bombings in Germany, from which they made off with nearly $2.5 million. Such attacks have been deemed a growing concern in the country, where, according to the Associated Press, an estimated 414 ATMs were blown up in 2020 alone.
Thanks for watching. Would you rather get robbed while house sitting for a friend, or deposit cash into an ATM only to realize the machine is a fake? Let us know in the comments section below.